Welcome to Season 6 of the Casted Podcast, where we are back with more of our very own users. Why? Because in Season 5, you really showed up and said that you loved those interviews, and also really because becoming a Casted customer makes it really clear how committed you are to not only the bigger picture of podcasting and how it all fits into your marketing efforts, but also how podcasting and shows in general really fit into an overall integrated marketing strategy. These customers, these marketers, are the most forward-thinking brands. They're harnessing the perspectives of experts with podcasts, and they are wringing out those interviews to be amplified across all other channels. They're practicing what we preach here at Casted, and I want you to hear all about what they are doing, why they're doing it, and how you can do it too. I'm Lindsay, CEO and co-founder of Casted, the first and the only amplified marketing platform for B2B marketers. And this is our podcast. Today, I'm talking with Sam Balter of ZoomInfo. I am so excited about this episode, not only because ZoomInfo's show Talk Data to Me, isn't that a great name, is a great example of a company leaning into their expertise as a brand, but also because Sam is a podcasting and content veteran who really has a firm grasp on the power that audio can have in a strategy. In this interview, you will hear how Sam and his team brought their show together, brought it all to life, and about how he's used his own experience working with podcasts in a previous life to create a show that really focuses on solving problems for their audience and is really, really fun to listen to. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Lindsay. How's it going?
I'm so glad that you're here. We got a lot to talk about today, and thank you for joining me on the show.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. So happy to talk about podcasting.
Yes, talk podcasting instead of talk data, right? Which is the name of your show, Talk Data to Me, which is, we were talking a little bit before we started recording, like one of the best titles I think I've ever heard for a show.
Yes, that is not at all me. That's all my co-host, Stephanie. She came up with that title for the show. So very happy with it.
Kudos to Stephanie, because that's a really fun name. So I guess that's a great place to start then. Let's talk a little bit about the show, how it came to be. And then I think kind of, unlike some shows we do, we'll kind of work backwards from there and kind of get into kind of why podcasting and all that good stuff. So let's get started at Talk Data to Me. How did it come to be and what role do you play with it? You said that you're the host, but tell me more.
Yeah, so Talk Data to Me is a show that ZoomInfo made. We started making it last year. And one of the things is I manage the editorial team. And basically what we do is we take data from ZoomInfo's platform, and then we notice kind of trends or interesting things about that data. And then we write articles about it, right? And so we were starting to build up this kind of like library of trends and interesting topics. And then we wanted to make a show to kind of dig deeper into those, right? And specifically to kind of like add a little bit of a human element behind a lot of the kind of, for lack of a better word, like boring-ish data trends, and sort of tell kind of interesting stories that are associated. Boring-ish, like for I understand most people don't find it super interesting to look at like job title trends over time or something like that. But I do, and it's exciting. So boring-ish, like boring for some people, not for everyone. Exactly. So basically what we did is then we started working on the show and really kind of digging into like what is that we want this show to do for ZoomInfo, and also like what is it we're trying to accomplish in terms of for the like listener. What do we want the listener's experience to be? And how can we add on to the work that we're already doing in terms of writing articles, pulling data, all this interesting stuff? Like how can we add on to that and not in a new way without just sort of like regurgitating old things, I guess.
Right. Super fun. Okay. So that was one of the things, from what I understand, conversations that we'd had a while ago, that was one of the things that you intended to do when you started at ZoomInfo was launch podcast, right? So tell me why. Tell me why and kind of where it fits into the bigger picture strategy for marketing and for content at ZoomInfo.
Yeah. So I think definitely coming in early to ZoomInfo, I wanted to start a podcast immediately. But I think for a little while, we had to figure out like, what is the right topic? Yeah. What is the right angle? How would a podcast fit into this company? And so I think that took a little bit of time just sort of to get acclimatized to the company, get acclimatized to like what we could do and the type of thing we could be talking about. So then one of the things overall, I think from my perspective, one of the issues with ZoomInfo's kind of brand or marketing is that a lot of people know us as primarily a data provider. Mm-hmm. Like we provide a lot of data. But I think that people are sort of missing the part where there's all of these tools that we build on top of that data that lets you do incredible things. So it's like it makes your email list more effective, your ad campaigns better. You can look up people more effectively. You know what I mean? There's just you can route leads more effectively. There's all these great things you could do with the data. And so we wanted to really zero in on that part.
Yeah.
That like transition of just like, we want to showcase as a brand that we have lots of interesting pieces of data that you can use, but then also sort of emphasize that it's not just having it, but it's like being able to take action on it and taking action on it and what that leads to, right? It leads to like insightful, interesting ideas. It leads to people changing the way their business operates. It leads to people getting money or funding more effectively, right? So we wanted to focus on that part of it. And I think that took a little while to figure out at the job. But once we got that, it was like, okay, great. Now we have a direction to sort of march in.
Mm-hmm. That is the interesting part, because data is cool, but I think obviously the exciting part is what you do with it and getting people's wheels turning around that action and the insights, that can really fuel behaviors and strategies. And that is the cool stuff. And so there's a lot of stories there. I bet you're having a lot of fun pulling those stories.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, for us, like, it also, I'm a big believer in shows just being like relatively simple and relatively straightforward in format, but flexible. So it's like with that for the show, it makes a lot of sense, because we could say life before insight, then an insight happens, and then there's life after insight.
And that's
so
storytelling.
It's like,
yeah, that's
super easy to set it up. And so it's like, great. Okay, now we have a format that works. That makes sense. And then the other thing was like, okay, what are the major parts to our episode? That became pretty clear pretty quickly, where it was like the parts of each episode. There's going to be the data. There's going to be a question that data inspires. And then there's going to be like an interview with an expert who's going to be able to give us some sort of story or context beyond it.
Yeah.
And so like that, again, like once we had that all formed, it was like, great, this is perfect for ZoomInfo's brand. It will do a good job of like building it up. And it's a flexible enough format where it's like, okay, we could be talking about one set of data or one topic in a season, or dive deep into another season, or just broadly comment on a bunch of different issues that are kind of relevant to people within our target market. So basically it gave us a good way, once we figured it out, to just be like, this is the direction we're moving in. Now we just need to find the people to interview.
I love it. So how do you find the people to interview? How do you, I mean, you have lots of customers. There's lots of people that are using data. So I'm sure there's no shortage, but how do you select those people? And how do you know that there's a story there? Like, how do you do that data mining for stories, right?
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting, because it's like, if you think about a lot of B2B podcasts, you have this thing where you're getting the person onto the show and then they're telling you about something, right? We wanted in some ways to use this as slightly different, where we're presenting a piece of data or information to somebody else, to the guest on the show, and having them help us contextualize that piece of information. So we don't really start with the guest. We start with the data, and then we're like, who could possibly talk to us about this? And that part is really fun and definitely challenging. Like, for example, we have one in an upcoming episode. We have like Scott Brinker. Scott Brinker is going to be on. He's great. He's super fantastic. But the piece of data for him was like, we looked at the number of tools that somebody in marketing or sales in a company uses, right? And it just seemed like so like too many tools. Like an average company uses like something like 75 tools on average. Tech companies will use like hundreds of different tools. And we were like, okay, people are using a lot of tools. This is annoying. This is something I feel in my own life where I'm like switching between different platforms or different pieces of software. Like this has a human element where I feel it. And then it's like, who can talk to me about there being too many tools? Scott Brinker can. Like Scott Brinker will know the answer to like why there are too many tools in this world.
Yes.
So I think like that would be an example of like we had a question and there was really only a few people who could answer it. And then in other ones we had like Mike Volpe was on the show. And for him, it was like, okay, we've seen this absolutely outrageous rise in web conferencing tools, in people using, video conferencing, all of these tools people are adopting to work from home. But like, we could tell that story, but also like, what's the opposite side? And like the opposite side was like business travel collapsed.
Yeah.
And people were not going to meet face-to-face anymore.
Right.
So it's like, who is the best person to talk about that? Like, okay, great. Mike Volpe, who's like heading up this company that does B2B travel. Like he's going to be the best answer for that question and that story.
I love that. That is so fun. So let's get into format. So how many shows are you doing, period? I don't know if that means like within a year, within a month, within a season. Tell me about the format that you're thinking for the show and kind of like how you're putting it together.
Yeah, this show is a challenge.
It's intense. It's not a light load.
Yeah, not fully intentionally. Like I think one of the things about the show that's interesting is one, I've never done a co-hosted show. So it's like I'm co-hosting it with Steph Tonneson, and she's like, it's good because we both approach data and questions differently. So we're able to like, we wanted to like emphasize that point of things about data or things about insights not being clear, right? And like, it's useful to have somebody to talk about things with and be like, I don't understand this. How would you approach this? How do you look at this? This an episode came out about brand ambassadors, right? And one of that was a good one, but like, Steph has a completely different view because she's in her early 20s. I'm in my 30s of like what a brand ambassador is compared to like what I think a brand ambassador is.
Yeah.
And then we can look at this trend about like what has happened to brand ambassadors over the last few years and then have like a very good conversation. So format wise, one, we wanted to emphasize that there's two hosts and they're wrestling through these issues together.
Yeah.
So basically the format of the episodes goes cold open, where we have an intro that sets up sort of the problem, the question, the piece of data that we're looking at. Then it jumps into the interview. During the interview, we try and do at least kind of 1 to 2 interludes. So it's like, pause, let's try and like work through this, or I didn't quite understand this part, or could you contextualize this part? Then and that keeps going through back to the interview. Then it has a closing where it's like at the end of each episode, Steph and I talk through for like 15 or 20 minutes about what we learned from the episode and then shorten that down to probably like a kind of 2-minute highlight reel of what we're having. But it's like a very casual conversation. So that's every episode is like, there's the intro. It's like you go through the interview, then you write the intro, then you write the 2 interludes, then something was wrong with the intro. So you go back there, then you were like, after you've done all that, you do the closing. And it's like, then the closing has to go back to the intro again. So it's like a lot of reworking things over and over again. But I think it has a really nice format for what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that comes through when you're listening to it. I mean, it's such a good show. Like it's well done.
Thank you.
It's great. Okay. So this, I mean, if it's not glaringly obvious to anybody who's watching or listening, this is not your first go around. You know a thing or two about podcasting. So tell me about your history with podcasting and what maybe you did before ZoomInfo and how that impacted this.
Yeah. So before ZoomInfo, I worked at HubSpot. In HubSpot, I was predominantly for most of the time in sort of like demand generation, sales enablement. that side of the funnel, then moved over. And then I had this opportunity where they were starting the show called Weird Work, and they were looking for somebody to host the show. And so I applied to host, got it. It was a great experience, and the show did really well to start. It got on like iTunes New and Noteworthy. It got picked up a bunch of places. And so that went really, really well. And then basically I moved over to the content team to work on just kind of growing the network of podcasts that HubSpot had. And at that time, it was Weird Work. There was a single season of Skill Up, and then the Grow Show had been going for a few years. And so it was like trying to look at this of saying like, okay, how do we move from, these kind of individual shows to more of like a concrete strategy of how we're approaching like multiple shows on a podcast. So then working there, I was definitely a lot more focused on the like audience growth and the like strategy behind how do we fit this podcast into other things, and how do we like take advantage of things that are going on the content team to convert or create interesting like content, audio content that could be podcast. So it's like we changed up Skill Up. We helped, they were launching a show, Culture Happens, to like emphasize things about company culture. There was a show, Agency Unfiltered, that was a web series that we wanted to move that to become another podcast. Like there are a lot of good, so we just did a lot of those kind of things along building out a larger strategy for a lot of shows.
Yeah. So tell me how that experience is. I mean, that was a lot of experiences in a condensed, relatively speaking, I'm sure not a long period of time compared to this and launching a show for the first time at ZoomInfo. What are some of the similarities and differences?
Yeah. I think the major difference is like, one, HubSpot had a show that had been around for years. Like the Grow Show is a great launching off point, and there was sort of like an engine of content and a way of approaching shows as well. Like there was already, Matt Brown was like a great audio producer. There was already an audio producer in-house, all of those things. ZoomInfo was just starting from scratch, right? There's internal podcast. There's several internal podcasts, but there's no external facing podcast. And so a lot of the stuff of like setting up hosting, educating the company on like educating people on like what is a reasonable amount of downloads to expect, how, this is how you track and what we can track with this information. This is why we should make the show in this way and not that way. So there was like a lot of education aspects of it that went along with starting it up.
Interesting. So, okay. So what have you learned this time around? Simply because things have changed. I mean, like content has changed, technology has changed. We're case in point, we're recording both audio and video here. I mean, that's podcasting now. So what's changed since your days at HubSpot and managing those shows versus now, if anything? I mean, or is it really kind of, it's still about who your audience is and serving them well with content? Kind of what comparisons have you found there?
Yeah, I'd say, it didn't get any easier. That would be one thing.
It sounds like the load is still pretty heavy with what you've created there at ZoomInfo.
Yeah, but it's also like I guess it didn't get any easier to like. It's nerve-wracking. It's a nerve-wracking process to build a show, and it's a nerve-wracking process to like get out there and interview people. And none of that is different doing it a second time. I honestly thought some of that would be a little bit easier, but it's still kind of like a very stressful experience. What's changed larger? I think there's two things, and that's like the producers and the people who are producing shows and the people who are listening to shows. I think on the production side, people are just producing better podcasts in general, right? I think like the quality is rising at a really basic level. Audio quality is rising. Like people are more likely to record with a mic. People are more likely than they used to be to record like in a semi-soundproof room.
To do editing at all, to
do editing. Yeah. To like do editing. Like people are like there's a lot of things that people have raised the quality on in kind of the business space. But I'd say also in the consumer kind of more broadly appealing podcast, it's like they they have all these new formats that are just insane, like really heavily sound designed shows, or shows that are really, really short. They're only like a couple of minutes, right? Like, I think, I haven't listened to it yet, but I know like Paris Hilton's working on a podcast, and Paris Hilton's podcast is going to have like micro news episodes that are like just her hot takes on something that it's like a minute long. And those are just going to be interspersed with 30-minute episodes, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that is going to help pull up things where you can change the formats of the show and you can have more options as a producer. And I think because of like all the stuff we're starting to see in that area, you're also getting listeners who are a little bit more open to something that's potentially different. Right? Like, listeners are more open to, oh, this isn't just a straight interview. Like, listeners want higher quality production. Listeners are willing to say like, oh, this is like a 10-minute show. This could be great. Or this is a 45-minute episode. Like, maybe it's a really in-depth thing. Or, oh, I think about Command Line Heroes as like another kind of podcast that I admire. Like, they're building fully narrative, deeply researched episodes. Like, I just think that consumers are going to start to demand and want more of that, and they're going to be more open-minded to it when they see it.
I think you're so right. I think that what I've seen, even over, my first podcast was, we started working on it in 2017, launched in 2018, and then, casted. We've been doing this for a year and a half, 2 years. And just in that time, like that's a relatively short period of time, like the quality and like you said, the expectation of your audience. And that absolutely, per usual, is driven by consumer audiences, but here we are in B2B, and your B2B audience is still people. Like, it's still humans that do watch Netflix and that do listen to the shows produced by Gimlet and, want really good stuff. And if they're going to listen to a B2B podcast, they want to be entertained and educated, right? And so it's a huge opportunity. It's an exceptional opportunity to create really great content and to be one of the standout brands that drives a huge following because of what you're producing. I mean, look at what you've done with data, right? With boring-ish, air quotes if you're listening, boring-ish data. You've created a really cool show. So what advice would you give to other, enterprise marketers, people who are listening, somebody who represents a brand who either already has a show and is like, man, how do I level up? How do I know that it has to be better? Or somebody who's super intimidated about doing what you've done, not only at ZoomInfo, but at HubSpot too?
I think there are a lot of people who are nervous that they don't fit the profile of somebody that they think is like a podcast person. And that might make them a little bit antsy about starting. Like, oh, I'm not, like super boisterous, or I'm not really articulate, or I don't have a particularly like silky smooth voice to be able to like, lull people asleep or whatever with. Like, they don't have that, and they get worried. But that's not really what people are looking for. You can edit around things. Like, if you don't like something, you don't have to publish it. Like, it's okay. So I think like there are a lot of people who are nervous about a lot of things about podcasting or being on microphone that just aren't really necessarily justified, and that they could give it a try pretty easily without kind of fitting what you would imagine sort of the standard archetype of like a podcast person would be. I think especially for brands, I'd say people should really start with a problem they are trying to solve at their company first, and then figure out what the show or how audio will fit in. I think a lot of the times, like, it doesn't have to be for reach, or for like a lot of downloads or for things like that. Like, if you have trouble communicating to employees internally, maybe you should make an internal show that once a month provides like all the updates they need. Maybe you want to tell kind of case studies of customers onboarding because people are kind of hesitant. Great. Maybe you could use a show to do that. Maybe you want to run sales training internally or something. Maybe you could do a show to do that. I think it's bad to start with the idea that's like, oh, like I'm a funny person, or like I'm interesting, or like Joe has really great ideas. Joe's super smart. Let's just have Joe on the mic and talk about stuff.
Let's just like hop on let's just start recording. Yeah.
Yeah. Just start recording. Cause like, that's great. It's like, it's not great. It's not great. It's not. And it's like, why are you doing this? And so I think like podcast doesn't have to be this like big complicated thing or anything like that. Like, but it should solve some problem that your company has. And a lot of the times it's like, it could be a source to generate new content on other mediums. It could be all of these different things, but you should just identify what you're trying to do with your show and then work backwards for what is the format of the show that would make the most sense to solve this problem. And then think, how many episodes do I need? Right? Like,
yeah. Not are we going to do one every week forever and ever, but like, yeah, how many episodes? It's like your teacher. Back in the day, we all had that teacher where you ask how long the essay needs to be, and they say as long as it needs to be, right? Like that's how many shows you do, as many as you need to do. I don't know. There's no.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't know if the format, it's like for Talk Data to Me, like I think about it, it's like Talk Data to Me, we want to emphasize the breadth and depth of data and also talk about the process of drawing insights from data. That could go on for a while. You know what I mean? Like that is a problem we should continually, year after year, day after day, continue to work on and solve. Like it's not going to be solved in one thing, but like that's a long-term show. But if it's like the show is, how ZoomInfo sales reps operate, that could probably be 6 episodes and it doesn't need to be updated all the time.
Yep.
It could probably be accomplished with a set number of episodes.
Yes. And that's why, people will ask me, and I bet they do with you too, about like kind of best practices and like, how often should I publish and how long should my show be? And, all these what's standard? And it's like, no, I mean, this is content strategy and it should be a part of your content strategy to say, how are we serving our audience? I love the perspective. I mean, it's a great exercise to do, to say, what are 3 problems that our sales team has or that our brand has? How can we solve that with content? If we had a magic wand, what gift could we give our sales team that they'd be like, oh my gosh, seriously? Like I have this recording and I can go use this. Like that's a great place to start.
Yeah, it's just easier to start there. I think like the other thing I think is people should move towards the more exciting version of whatever they're thinking.
Yes.
Right. Like, like I think people should just be if there's a more exciting version, if it's like, oh, we could do, a 1 hour in-depth interview with one person. It's like, it would be more exciting if we did like 3 or 4 people. Do 3 or 4 people.
Yes.
Just do that. Move towards that version if you think that's the more exciting version. Because if you're not excited initially as the creator about it, like you are not really going to pass that on to the listener at all.
Yeah, they're going to smell that right away. Okay, so super great tips and insights and experience and expertise. Is there anything that you would leave our audience with as they are, again, trying to figure out, I think looking holistically at where it fits in their strategy, like how to use their podcast? I think it's pretty clear everybody should have one. You and I are pretty biased on that, but how do you use it? How do you get the most out of it? Maybe we can leave them with those words.
So I think that there's a temptation by a lot of marketers to be really into the recycle, reuse methodology of like, you have something, you create that, and then you make thousands of different versions and you try and get everything working, right? Like where you take like a long white paper, you cut it into a bunch of blog posts, you take each of those blog posts, you turn social media posts about those, right? And you generate like lots and lots of content. I think sometimes what people do with podcast is that they try and fit them into that process. So they think like, what articles and data and things like that are we already producing? And can we just, produce a podcast that like fits into this process? And I think in a lot of ways you can, but it might be better to just start by thinking more about like, what would be a good podcast? What is good content? And then how do we fit it into what we're currently doing? Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes for marketing, like when I think about a lot of the shows that have been successful, they're built more in a little silo. They're actually built with it's like, we want to make a successful podcast, not necessarily a successful podcast that could then turn into social, that could then turn into this. And people get bogged down with all the other process pieces to a podcast. And so it's like, start with a really good show. And then once you have a really good show, it's very easy to cut it into all of those things.
Yeah.
But if you're a marketer and you're part of like a larger company, there might be a temptation to sort of be like, oh, like let's work with this team and this team and this team and bring all these people in. And I think to some degree, it's really hard to work in audio in that way. Mm-hmm. It's just really hard to have it's like if you had 10 writers working on one blog post, like it would be unlikely to be very good. So if you have in the same way, even though a podcast is more complicated and more time, you don't necessarily want to bring every single person into the company into it.
Yeah.
You want to make something that's good, go check out what we made. It will fit in and then start being social copy, being articles about it, being different ways that that it can evolve.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but for me, when I came into ZoomInfo, it was, there's three phases that I set for my team. Phase one was data from the platform and turn it into articles. Phase two is data from the platform and turn it into articles and also turn it into a podcast. So that was phase two. And phase three is articles that involve the podcast and the podcast that involve articles. We're not even we launched the show and we're not at phase three.
Yeah.
When there's still another step to go before it's we're getting towards the how it all fits together, because it'll be a better product when we have good articles that perform well, that goes with a good podcast that performs well, and that will in end create a better combination of things.
Yeah.
So I'd say for people starting out, it would definitely be, I would encourage people to really narrow into what is going to be a good show on its own and not necessarily get bogged down with a lot of the kind of marketing processes that are often happen at large companies.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. And we talk a lot about amplifying your content and taking your show and amplifying it across other channels. And I think one way that's sometimes misconstrued is more content for more content's sake. Take your show and, pull it into 156 clips. And then each one of those clips should also be sent, out to at least 55 people. That's just more content for more content's sake. And sure, okay, that's one philosophy, cast a wide net. But when you, right now, I'm capturing your unique perspective, Sam Balter on our show, that's adding a lot of value for our audience. That's why everybody who's watching is watching. And, we're capturing it as audio and video, right? Giving people the option to watch or listen. And then from there, why wouldn't we dig in and pull out the insights into something that's really deep and rich that gives people another choice for where to watch, to consume that content. But it's certainly not, just more for the sake of more, because that just adds to the noise, right? So yeah, it's content strategy for a reason. Think strategically about what's going to add value to your audience and how you're going to be set apart as a thought leader and a trusted guide in the space. And that starts with really great content, period. That's got to be great to start with.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not every minute of a show is good, right?
Except for this show, of course. I mean, this episode. Yeah,
this show, it's 100% of the minutes are good, but it's
every other episode in the world.
But yeah, it's people, it's why don't we cut it in, 20, it's are there 25? If there's one good line, if there's one really, really good line or one really good quote or a really good audio clip, that one will outperform you putting out 10. And so I think sometimes it's that's sort of what I mean of a lot of the times you see marketing teams run this content for content's sake process. And it's not always the most beneficial.
Right.
And it's not always the most beneficial for a podcast if you're trying to build one to immediately trying to fit into that.
Yep. Start with a really, really solid show. And that you're going to want to mine for more and be like, oh, this was so amazing. Let's give our audience more of it. Because they want it.
If it's good, you'll use it.
Yeah.
Like if you make delicious food, people will eat it. You know what I mean? Like
come back
you're
for more.
doing good things, like it will result in good results.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's better. People have a limited amount of space that they can think about stuff. So it's better to just relentlessly focus on, am I making a good show? Am I getting good guests? Are we building a good thing? Rather than like, how can I squeeze every last second of this podcast out into like another asset or another format?
Yep. You're missing the point. That's like writing, like solely writing content for SEO value. Same thing as like solely making a show to create lots of clips from it, right? It's not what it's about. Like, sure, you can, but you're missing the point. So
yeah, those clips are probably not going to be that great, but maybe they will. I don't know.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing all of your insights and all of your experience. Talk Data to me is awesome. If those who have not listened yet, you need to, because it's great. That's our show. Thanks so much for listening. And for more from today's guest and some pretty amazing content that they've inspired, visit casted.us and be sure to subscribe to our newsletter to get the latest on all things amplified marketing, B2B podcasting, and a lot more.